In Laudato Si, Pope Francis singles out one of the greatest challenges facing the world's population today, the degradation of our environment. He clearly states the survival and well-being of humankind is tied to the survival and well-being of our environment. This concept of human integral ecology is repeated throughout the encyclical. It is clear that Pope Francis is not only condemning our poor stewardship of the environment, but he is calling us to a greater sense of responsibility and brotherhood in our relations with one another, to call us to a greater sense of social justice, which of course is an integral part of Catholic social teaching. Why the urgency? Why is this the pressing moral issue Pope Francis claims it is? The irreversible and lasting effects of human activity have steadily become more apparent. The 10 warmest years ever recorded have occurred since the year 2000. Virtually all scientists agree that fossil fuel consumption has led to increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that have caused surface temperatures to rise. One US scientific publication stated that current trends suggest unchecked fossil fuel consumption will increase the risk of coastal flooding, droughts, severe storms, heat waves, food and water shortages, and other harmful effects. And who feels the burden most directly and dramatically? The poor, the vulnerable, the homeless. Climate change is also one of the causes of poverty and forced migration, which are the breeding grounds for human trafficking, forced labor, prostitution, even organ trafficking. And again, it is the poor and the vulnerable who are most often the victims of these criminal acts. Pope Francis' encyclical adds a persuasive and a powerful voice to summon the world to action and to protect the least among us. The challenge of stopping and attempting to reverse the damage we have caused to the environment will require nothing short of a global political, economic, and social response. Politically, the release of the Pope's encyclical was, of course, met with mixed reactions. President Obama stated, "I welcome His Holiness Pope Francis' encyclical and deeply admire the Pope's decision to make the case clearly, powerfully, and with the full moral authority of his position for action on the global climate change." Secretary Kerry added, "The Pope's powerful encyclical calls for a common response to the critical threat of climate change poses to our common home. His plea for all religions to work together reflects the urgency of the challenge." Other positive reactions were echoed across the globe and the political sphere. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, "The Pope's first encyclical emphasizes that climate change is one of the biggest challenges facing humanity, and it is a moral issue that requires respectful dialogue with all parts of society." The World Bank president emphasized today's release of Pope Francis' first encyclical should serve as a stark reminder to all of us of the intrinsic link between climate change and poverty. And some of the most enthusiastic responses naturally came from environmental groups. The president of the World Wildlife Foundation called the Pope's voice a much-needed moral approach to the climate debate. Climate change is no longer just a scientific issue, it is increasingly a moral and ethical one. But not all responses have been enthusiastic. We have also heard vocal opponents of the encyclical, with some claiming Pope Francis is stepping into territory beyond his religious experience and expertise. In the United States, we've heard voices of politicians and presidential candidates who say the Pope's mandate is not to give advice on scientific matters. One candidate said, "I don't get my economic policy from my bishop or my cardinal or my pope." In a piece for the New York Times recently, the journalist Gail Collin noted only 3% of the current Republican members of Congress have been willing to go on the record as accepting the fact that people are causing global warming. On the papal plane back from his November Africa trip, Pope Francis said, "We are on the brink of suicide with our treatment of the environment," and he urged parties of the December Paris COP21 UN conference on climate change to take bold action. In that conference, almost 200 nations came together to address the challenges of climate change and the destruction of our environment. The result was, in the words of Secretary Kerry, the strongest, most ambitious global climate agreement ever negotiated. More than 180 countries representing 95% of global emissions made individual commitments to reduce emissions. What we witnessed in Paris was an unprecedented example of a commitment to save our planet, not just by governments, but a commitment by religious organizations, non-governmental organizations, youth and environmental activists. But now comes the hard part, implementation. I want to highlight some of the challenges and opportunities that the Pope's encyclical and the implementation of climate change agreements presents for governments and other political bodies. In the months and the years ahead, it will be up to each government to break the old habits and to rethink the use of our finite natural resources. The transition to renewable resources and sustainable energy will require a fundamental change in the way we decide to power our planet and in our approach to development. Pope Francis's encyclical adds a moral imperative to governments to implement the change. One challenge to the transition to renewable energy sources is our reliance on fossil fuels. Fossil fuel production around the world is a lucrative business, although it's a little bit less lucrative given the price of oil at $35 a barrel rather than $100 a barrel. And there are entrenched political and economic interests in keeping the production going. One American research group found that companies with interest in oil and gas contributed more than $70 million to US federal candidates in the 2012 election cycle, more than double that from 2010. Political donations from the industry, which includes gas producers, refiners, natural gas pipeline companies, gasoline stations, fuel oil dealers, have taken on an increasingly conservative tint over the last 2 decades. In the US 2012 election cycle, 90% of its contributions went to one party. Another challenge is simply getting everybody to agree that climate change is real and it is part caused by human action. There are some who don't want to believe the science and who discredit science for their own political and economic gain. But transitioning to renewable energy presents a significant economic opportunity for countries. In the long term, carbon-intensive energy is one of the costliest investments any government can possibly make. When you factor in the cost of agriculture and environmental degradation, of the hospital bills for asthma, for emphysema patients, the millions of deaths that are linked to air pollution caused by the use of fossil fuels, and the cost of rebuilding after devastating storms and flooding, only then do you see the full cost of investing in these energy sources. Clean energy is cheap in comparison, and the private sector has an enormous opportunity to be innovative and develop new markets for renewable energy. Governments are not without options in implementing emission reduction commitments. Partnering with private sector is one way to achieve this goal, as are passing legislation and supporting environmentally friendly projects in government spending. Since the release of the encyclical, we've seen a number of major initiatives to combat climate change in the United States using some of these tools. At the beginning of last month's climate conference in Paris, President Obama and Bill Gates launched Mission Innovation. This initiative is a public-private partnership that aims to accelerate the clean energy revolution through expanding into clean energy research and development funding. The launch statement for this initiative was signed by the United States, China, France, and a dozen other countries. Meanwhile, 154 of the largest US companies, including Walmart, AT&T, Coca-Cola, and Facebook, representing 11 million jobs and more than $7 trillion in market capitalization, signed the White House American Business Act on Climate Pledge. These businesses pledged to reduce their emissions, increase low-carbon investments, deploy more clean energy, and take other actions to build more sustainable businesses and tackle climate change. President Obama and the Environmental Protection Agency also announced the Clean Power Plan, a historic and important step in reducing carbon pollution from power plants. The Clean Power Plan is designed to strengthen the fast-growing trend toward cleaner and lower polluting American energy. The government also awarded a contract for the federal government's first ever joint solar-powered procurement in California and Nevada. The procurement will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save the government on energy costs over the long term. Governments cannot forget another important option: partnering with religious leaders and organizations. Religious groups have been deeply concerned about climate change for decades and are at the forefront of the global effort to combat it. A diverse array of religious groups have issued religious statements on climate change, such as the Baha'i, Buddhists, Protestants, and Catholics, Jews, and Unitarians, just to name a few. It is religious institutions and leaders that have the moral voice and that can inspire action and offer hope. Laudato Si is a historic voice from an influential religious leader. There is no question that Laudato Si has motivated and inspired many around the world to revisit their views on and take action against climate change. In the United States, we've seen the impact of the encyclical on Catholic and non-Catholic groups. President Obama welcomed the Pope's lending his moral authority to encourage people to act. Several US mayors and one governor attended a conference hosted by the Vatican last July on creating sustainable cities. They joined the other participants in signing an agreement to reduce the impact of climate change on the local level, especially on the vulnerable. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the American organization Catholic Climate Covenant have used the encyclical to reinvigorate efforts to raise awareness about the dangers of climate change and to encourage legislative and community action. Pope Francis reminds us that we're all interconnected and our fortunes are intertwined. And we're grateful for that voice. So thank you for having me today, and thank you for your efforts to raise awareness about this important global challenge. Thank you.